Hey everyone! So I have a very important question. Did you know that body language that can be perfectly acceptable here in America can be painfully rude in China? We know that Chinese culture is a lot more reserved than our culture in America, and that is really reflected in their body language. This is important to know because if we were to travel to China or be around people who practice the Chinese traditions and are deeply rooted in those traditions, we might offend them if we don't understand their body language and their culture, which body language is a lot of their culture, so it's very important for us to know. As far as who I am a student at Columbia State who's researched this topic very thoroughly because I want to differentiate the culture differences, particularly in body language between the Chinese and us in America. My main points. I want to touch base on the fact that public displays of affection are very limited. Frequently bumping into each other is a very normal and accepted thing in China. I want to touch base also on that praise results in very excessive facial expressions. That in Chinese culture, people tend to wear their emotions on their face, especially when receiving a compliment or praise or anything of that matter. And my last point is the fact that people greet each other in a very formal, non-physical way, which is very different than how we do things in America. So touching back to my first point, when I say that China is very conservative, they don't like public displays of affection. So in America, we can hold hands. It is acceptable. It is sweet. It is fine. But in China, holding hands is only okay among friends. It is very inappropriate to hold hands among partners and is very frowned upon in Chinese culture. According to the article Body Language in the Culture of Asian Countries, China is one of the most conservative countries in Asia. That's why touching is rare. In China, it is rare to see public display of affection. Holding hands is all right, but only as a sign of friendship, according to this article. Secondly, I want to touch base on frequent bumping. Because China is so overly populated, people will bump into each other like crazy. And I think that this is very alarming that people will not say, "excuse me," when they bump into each other. Here in America, if I were to bump and ram into somebody, I would say, "oh, I'm so sorry, excuse me." But in China, it's such an accepted part of life and such an unavoidable that they don't even acknowledge when they bump into somebody. That is very beyond me and very shocking to learn. I also learned of that information from the last article about Asian culture in general, but fact is especially true of China because of how populated China is. My third point is the excessive blushing and excessive facial expressions particularly when receiving praise in China. Throughout Chinese cartoons, comics, in real life, we see an exaggeration of facial expressions, particularly blushing. I know whenever I watch a Chinese film, the characters will always blush to indicate a certain emotion. I have a first-person account by Aaron Wells when he went to Shanghai, and he said that the waitresses there, whenever he gave them a compliment or complimented how good the food was, the waitresses would blush like crazy. You would see their facial expressions. They would light up. My opinion is maybe they're not used to receiving praise, but it seemed very connected to the other things I saw, that in China, especially the females, they will show a lot of their emotions on their face, usually in the form of blushing. Lastly, I want to touch base on the body language when Chinese people are introducing themselves to each other or are acknowledging themselves. They will do so in very non-physical ways, such as bowing, as nodding their heads, as handshaking. They have many non-physical ways, where they refrain from more intimate ways of showing a connection. Like they don't hug, they don't kiss, they don't do those things in public. They like to do things such as this very unique gesture that is called the fist and palm salute. And I'm going to show you that right now.
新的一年，好事连连，牛气冲天。祝所有的朋友们牛年平平安安，收获满满。
请大家拜年了。
See how they're connecting their palms? That is a very very common way of saluting somebody in China, and I just learned of that today. So, in conclusion, we have learned here that China is a lot more reserved, and they reflect this in their body language. We know that they don't really show public display of affection. We can see that frequent bumping into each other is very accepted and apparently a normal thing. We also see that excessive facial expressions are a normal thing too. And finally, we learn that they like to acknowledge each other in very non-physical ways. I think it is very important to know this information so that we do not offend anyone who's rooted in Chinese culture, especially if we visit China or if we have connections with Chinese people and interactions with them. We want to make sure that we are respectful so that we do not offend. Thank you so much for your time.